Well, you're all having such a great time. I didn't want to disturb you, but we got to start. I'm Peter, welcoming you all to City Lights, and for those of you online, welcome to you too. As always, we are beaming to you from the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush people, also known as the Bay Area. Tonight's event is being co-presented by Locus periodicals, or I should say Locus Publications, and MCD Books. We are celebrating Where the Axe is Buried, the new novel by Ray Nayler, and it's published by MCD. Following on the success of his debut novel, The Mountain in the Sea, Ray Nayler returns with a very compelling novel of cybernetic political intrigue and geopolitical espionage. It resonates well with the current political climate and offers a real page-turner. So really very delighted to have him here with us. Mr. Nayler won the Locus Award for Best First Novel for The Mountain in the Sea and the novella The Tusks of Extinction, called one of, quote, the up-and-coming masters of SF short fiction by Locus. These books, by the way, can be found at the front counter, and for those of you who are online, we will have signed copies. And for those of you who come up to have your book signed, I'm going to have you sign one of these Post-its, so please print legibly to whom you would like it inscribed. Mr. Nayler's stories have been published in Asimov Science Fiction, Clark's World, Analog Science Fiction, in fact, and many, many others. His stories have won the Clark's World Readers Poll and the Asimov Readers Award, and his noveletta Sarcophagus was a finalist for the Theodore Sturgeon Award. He's going to be joined in conversation tonight by Gideon Lichfield. Mr. Lichfield is an editor and journalist who was former global editorial director and editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, and prior to that served as editor-in-chief of the MIT Technology Review. So really, it's such a great honor to have you both with us here tonight. Welcome to City Lights.
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay, I'll stay at a bit of a distance. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, City Lights. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Ray, welcome home. You were telling me that you grew up with this bookstore.
Thank you. Yeah. So this event is a particularly big deal for me because I'm really not joking when I say I grew up in the Bay Area. I lived mostly in Fremont, and I used to come to City Lights bookstore. I came here throughout my childhood, my teenage years, you know, the time I was in university down at UC Santa Cruz, as an act of pilgrimage, really. This, for me, is the bookstore. This is the place that defines what an independent bookstore should be like. It's the place that I went to learn new things, and I learned a lot of new things here. It's the place with the most intimidating bookstore clerks, maybe in all of California or the nation, always reading some book I had never heard of that was way smarter than I was at the time. And so it's extraordinary to be here. It feels like one of those moments where you're like, wow, I've arrived. Like, it's amazing, right? It's incredible. Thank you so much, for hosting me. I heard that you've sold like over 1,000 copies of The Mountain in the Sea, which is extraordinary. 1,700. Wow. That's amazing. And yeah, just having my book on the shelf here, it's I can't even really put it into words. It's so mind-blowing. I really wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, and I just never stopped. No matter how stupid it seemed, to continue to want to be this thing that clearly wasn't going to work. And 30 years later, after having decided at about 16 that that's what I wanted to be, 30 years later at 46, The Mountain in the Sea was published, which I call the 30 years to overnight success story. But yeah, I'm really, really happy to be here. Thank you.
So were you writing all the time since 16?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there were probably periods, I think everybody has these periods, maybe all artists, all creative people have periods in their life where life is too difficult for one reason or another to sustain a creative practice. And things become very fragmented, or you might stop or get kind of blocked. But like, you could say that I think pretty consistently for 30 years I was writing. I mean, I published short stories in Ellery Queen's mystery magazine like in the early 2000s. I published in literary magazines in the late 1990s. And after I went overseas, kept writing poetry and short stories and stuff. So yeah, I think I pretty consistently.
By the way, Peter, I forgot to ask, how long do we have?
45.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Right, great. So, you're a full-time Foreign Service officer. When do you write and research now? How do you make the time?
I get up really early in the morning. I get up, I mean, it depends on what my current schedule is, but I'll get up as early as like 4:50, 5 o'clock, and write for an hour or an hour and a half before my day starts. Everybody else is asleep in my house, and it's nice and quiet. I find this is a great time to write because my brain is still a little bit caught up in like the sleep cycle of like dreams, and it seems very open to new things. I usually start by editing what I've written before. So I'll go back several pages and I'll read through what I've written before until I kind of fall through the trapdoor of that world and can start to write. And I don't do things like counting words or a lot of these. There's a lot of these sort of data points that I feel like a lot of writers have, which I find really distracting for myself, although they're motivating for other people. But you know, sometimes I feel like if I can get a couple of paragraphs at the end of a long passage, and I've also hammered at all the other sentences, that's a pretty good morning.
And for researching, because I assume you must do a fair amount of research for the books.
Yeah, I mean, researching is something that I do like continuously, and I think Patricia Highsmith had this wonderful thing that she says in Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction, which is the only writing guide I think people need to read in some ways, because it just doesn't really teach you how to write anything, but is an extraordinary like sort of window into her mind. She says the wonderful thing about writing a novel is that no matter what else is going on in your life, you're writing a novel. And so everything is something that you can use in the novel, including everything bad, right? And everything that's uncomfortable, that's just something that can go into your work. And I think when I'm writing a book, a lot of it is about like happenstance. You know, you're doing something and you think about something else. You're reading something and it leads you something else. You're going down all these rabbit holes. You're doing research on very specific things, but then that research leads to other things. You get interested in those things, and that shows up in the book too. And part of the pleasure of writing a novel is it's not like something that you plan out right in the beginning. It's like this process, and the process is really fun because it's like this, you know, curiosity. You're opening up to the world, and you're just sort of like, well, I can use this, and I can finally have a place to put that idea.
Right.
It's great.
All right, so let's come to your new book. Before we start, I know you wanted to read something from it.
Yeah. So I will read Breaking with Much Tradition, not from the fiction part of the book, but from the acknowledgments. All the way at the end, but not a spoiler. Just because I think one of the things that we should remember is books were never written in the time that they're published. Like, they're written a couple of years quite often before. And so they end up in times that they weren't necessarily meant for. And they can seem really predictive, which can be unfortunate. So, as I write these acknowledgments, a press conference is occurring in which a political prisoner, just released to the West in a prisoner swap, castigates his oppressive government for illegally deporting him. He did not want to be exchanged. He was willing to die in prison, so long as he could do so in his own country, the place where he was born and spent his entire life. I am a patriot, he says, and then his voice breaking, I want to go home. I am immediately struck by the way his statement loops back to the dedication of this book, for everyone who has lost a country. I could not have predicted such a feedback loop with the real world would occur just at this moment and bring everything full circle for me. I want to go home. No words could be more heartfelt. All over the world, right at this moment, people are losing their homes to authoritarianism in its many forms. The methods of loss are varied, from outright bombing to oppressive surveillance, from imprisonment for expressing religious, cultural, or personal beliefs, to the slow chiseling away of the right to make meaningful political choices. Some oppressions are easy to see. It is easy to identify the malevolent dictator clinging to power for decades, bleeding his country of its resources, killing and imprisoning anyone who stands in his way, maintaining as much personal power as he can. He always wears a dollar store mask of religion or patriotism, but nothing about him is really hidden. The question is not who he is, it is how to dislodge him. Other oppressions are more subtle. As countries succumb to increasing limits on personal choices and watch the value of their citizenship eroded by invasive algorithms, decreasing access to basic services, and by a raft of bland, technocratic pseudo-efficiencies that habituate the population to massive income disparities, political gridlock, and a bleaker, more precarious, more limited future in which the gig economy is just another name for piecework. And economic survival depends on monetizing every element of one's life and identity. And what is perhaps most infuriating and also most encouraging about our global moment is that it didn't have to be this way. History seems to repeat itself, but much of that apparent repetition is written onto its events in retrospect. Within the actual flow of time itself, much is determined by black swan events, happenstance, or the unexpected impacts of technologies invented for entirely different purposes. More, however, is determined by the ruts that systems create. Systems persist, patterning future systems long after they themselves have died out. The world is filled with examples, small and large, negative and positive, from the way that Roman law continues to echo its ancient viewpoints on family and property in the halls of our modern courtrooms, to the way that Stalin's speeches bore the traces of orthodox liturgical cadences unconsciously patterned on the lessons he had learned as a student in seminary. I've said before that one of the things that makes humans special among animals on Earth is that we use our language and culture to build castles in the air. And then we live in them. I would add that when those castles are ruined, we most often build on the old foundations, limiting the shape of what can be. But this is not always the case. Radically new forms also come into being. Change occurs. Ideologies die out. Ways of organizing the world fade forever into irrelevance. All systems fail. The results can be catastrophic or generative, and most often they're a mixture of both. And at every point along the way, there are people fighting against humanity's worst tendencies. People like the patriot I previously mentioned, with his voice breaking as he says he wants to go home. People who are willing to lose everything in the fight against oppression and seek real change, not for their own benefit, but for everyone. They, all of them, living and dead, are who I acknowledge here first. I am in awe of their courage, which is far greater than my own.
So, Ray and I met in December at a conference on the future of democracy, where indeed we were talking about some of these ideas about building something that is not on the foundations of what we had in the past, but is something fresh and new. We bonded over the fact that we had lived in a bunch of weird countries and learned a bunch of weird languages. His are weirder than mine. I think Russian, remind me, Albanian, Vietnamese, Azerbaijani, Turkmen.
Yeah.
Now you're learning Spanish for your next job. And I think that, because we also both have lived in some strange places, or even just a variety of places, let's say, we're both very interested in different forms of government and how they work, and in particular how they don't work. And so where the axe is buried has broadly two kinds of government in it. One of them is an authoritarian state, which is not called Russia, but clearly is Russia. And it is a perfect autocratic surveillance state. And the other is a set of Western countries which I would say are not really democracies so much as they're technocracies in your book. I'm going to obviously try not to spoil too much, but let's just say that AI plays a large part in their governance. And so it feels as if, you were saying earlier just now, all systems fail. And again, without giving away too much of what happens in the book, was that something that you were trying to portray, that all of these different models are going in a kind of a direction that fails?
Well, I mean, it's debatable as to whether they're going to fail. I think one of the sort of thought experiments, or one of the things that occurred to me, was that there's just a lot of different ways to form an authoritarian state. Like for me, if you wanted to break freedom down sort of fundamentally for me, I would say, I go to the idea of semiotic freedom, which I think is good because it has at least some basis in science. Animals that are more semiotically free would be animals that are capable of making many choices given a single input, and can do many different things to work with their environment and have good outcomes for themselves. That's a good definition of sort of semiotic freedom. Well, one of the ways you can limit someone from being free in that way is by simply forbidding them to do many of those things that they could have done. But there's many other ways that you can do this as well. I mean, one of them is you can just fail to provide them with a good education, right? So that they don't have those choices in the first place, because they can't construct those choices in their head, right? You can use an algorithm to channel their choice making along a pathway that is advantageous to you. You can simply tell them that something they believe is wrong in your society and that it's going to be done another way. And what all of these have in common is that they have a way of channeling and limiting freedom. And I think sometimes, I mean, where this sort of thinking came from is that I've lived in a lot of authoritarian states: Turkmenistan, Russia, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Azerbaijan, etc. And whenever I was around people from the European Union, for example, or other Americans, I found that we were often completely blind to the ways in which our societies are also channeling people away from healthy choice making, or limiting the choices they could make, or channeling their choices into what is productive for us as a society, etc. And I was trying to figure out if there's a way I could write about this where I showed both sides of this coin, and without doing this irritating thing where you make things equivalent, right? Where sure, Russia's an authoritarian state, but really the European Union, I mean, they even have rules about how a carrot should look, so it's the same. It's not the same, right? In one place, you get murdered for being a journalist. In the other place, it's really irritating to throw away a lot of carrots that don't look right, and these are not the same thing, right? But how you could sort of talk about the limitations of freedom in those different forms in one space. And that was kind of where that book started.
Yeah. I mean, we have right now in the world, you could say, two models, probably more, but two very prominent models of authoritarianism. There's the Russian model, which is very extreme, very strict, really denying people's freedoms, denying people truth. And there's the China model, which is still, repressive and uses a lot of censorship, but is much more about using technology to surveil people and therefore to understand them and understand their choices. And it felt to me in the book as if your technocratic Western states were converging somewhat on the China model. Is that something you feel is happening in reality?
Well, I mean, it's hard. It's not exactly the way that I perceived it. I more sort of took the China model. I took a lot of the technology in the book are just developments of things that are happening in China right now, and especially the kinds of technology that the fundamentally Han Chinese state is using to control the people that they've colonized on their western fringe, right? The Uyghurs and other people. So a lot of the ideas in the book are really from the Chinese model, but applied to a federation that looks on the surface a lot more like Russia. And that's because in my own work, what I saw a lot of, and I'm talking about my other job, what I saw a lot of was China was actually exporting its techniques to other authoritarian states and teaching them how to do the things that they were doing. But a lot of the things that China is doing are also sort of the darker side of a mirror, right, of things that we are doing here, like analyzing the kinds of choices that people make and then trying to push them toward making other choices. That's something that corporations do. It's also, something that governments are trying to do. There's whole institutions in government that are, and I'm not calling them evil, but there's whole institutions in government that are focused around the idea of nudging, right? Pushing people to make certain kinds of choices that we've deemed beneficial and getting them to change their behavior in certain kinds of ways. Nudging can be beneficial to a society as a whole. It can be things like trying to get people not to litter, right? Things like that. But it can also nudge people toward things that might not be healthy for them. And then you've got corporations trying to understand through massive collection of data how people make consumer choices. It's not fundamentally that different from what the Chinese government is doing, except that in one case, it's more interested in a profit margin, and in the other case, it's still interested in a profit margin, but that profit has a little bit more to do with governance. I'm not trying to form some kind of equivalence to the two, but I'm just trying to say that a lot of these things are a little bit like technologies that have overlap that can be used on a military scale and that can be used on a commercial scale, right?
I mean, it's a truism that all of the technology that we've been developing in the last few decades is dual use because it's it's multi-use rather. You can apply social media, you can apply AI, you can apply all of these things to whatever purposes you want. And so it feels to me as if the difference between what we might call, well, I didn't want to use the word democratic or not democratic because it feels to me like a not very helpful distinction at this point. But maybe let's just say states that care about the well-being of their citizens versus states that care about the power of the people running them. Mm-hmm. Both states could use the same techniques. Like there's that famous book, Nudge, by Cass Sunstein from about a couple of decades ago. Right. Nudge theory is a thing in Western democratic governments. The idea that you can push people towards beneficial choices and the idea that you can push people towards choices that maintain the existing power structure, they're just different moral values around a similar technique. Right. So I guess the question maybe here is, given that these forms of manipulation, let's call them all manipulation, let's call all of them manipulation, but given these forms of manipulation are possible, how do you create the basis for that manipulation to be to the general good of society as opposed to not?
Oh wow!
Just a small question.
I mean, I wish I had an answer for that. I think that you need, there's something that we put aside a lot, especially in the United States. I find we put this aside all the time. In the United States, we talk constantly about things as if they were just inevitable, right? Like whatever technology comes out, it's going to be used. Like where there's this competition, how we're going to use it. Like recently Google decided that like don't be evil was like not something that they needed to have in their corporate bylines, and I mean when they took the sort of controls off of how they were going to use AI, right? And like changed the way that they defined what they might do in the future because they realized they were limiting the things they could compete in. I think of everything as dual use in a certain way. And I think a really good example is something that a professor of mine at George Washington calls the war babies, which I think is a great term. So there are three things. The war babies all came out of World War II, and there are three of them. They are the rocket, radar, and the atomic bomb, right? Or atomic fission in general. They're really interesting because they allowed us to do three things that we had never been able to do before. One was to see at a great distance in good resolution. That's radar, right? Another one was to move things extremely quickly across great distances. And another one, which especially when combined with the rocket, was to destroy things at great distance, right? And so, but all of these things are dual use technologies. They have tons of peaceful uses, and they have tons of military uses. And one of the ways that you can tell if something is a dual use technology is the rocket is a great example, right? Every time we launch a rocket, we have to report that rocket launch to Russia. And the reason is because a rocket is an ICBM. A rocket is an intercontinental ballistic missile, because anything that is powerful to put anything into orbit is also powerful to deliver a nuclear payload to a target on planet Earth, right? So you have to report all peaceful rocket launches specifically because they are identical to the launch of a rocket for the purposes of war, right? And so there's this entanglement with the rocket between war and peace. And it's really, and radar is another good example. It was one of the first things that we measured when we had treaties about nuclear weapons, were things we could identify from space with national means of verification. Have you heard this term? It's something that showed up in the first sort of treaties about nuclear limitations, and what it means, what national means of verification are, is spy satellites. So national means of verification could identify things like silos, right, and radar installations. So all of the first treaties are about where you point your radar and how many silos you can have, because they're the only things you can verify. Everything else is just, you can move missiles around, you can do all sorts of stuff. So radar immediately became something that everyone was very worried about. Like being able to have early warning was something people were really worried about. And all of these things, and I think as AI emerges, you see that immediately it becomes dual use, right? But I think you don't even need to go that far. Every single technology we've ever had has always been a dual use technology from the moment the first human-like animal, the first tool user, picked up a rock. You can guarantee that the moment they picked up that rock, they thought of what they could do with it functionally, how they could use it to do something that had meaning for them in changing their environment, and then immediately about what they could do violently against some other human being that they are having a quarrel with, right? Or some other being, pre-human being they're having a quarrel with. So I think that fundamental dual use problem is embedded in all technology that we use.
And I think with AI, maybe the thing that makes AI different is that there is a propensity to trust it as if the technology itself is in charge. In other words, with every other technology, it being dual use, you still know that the technology is a tool. Like a nuclear bomb can't do anything unless you set it off. Radar can only see the things that you point it at. But there is this belief that AI could somehow, and this again is sort of, predicated in your book, this idea that AI could just like do it on its own and it wouldn't need human intervention. Where am I going with that question? I guess again it comes back to that issue of how do you make sure that there is a human guiding the values of the way that this technology is used?
So I think that often the problem is there is a human guiding the values and the way that technology is used.
Right, it's just the wrong human.
Yeah.
Or a human with the wrong incentives.
Right, it's fundamentally the wrong human with the wrong incentives. I think for me, the major problem with artificial intelligence is that it has built-in biases. There is always a human there, right? Because fundamentally what AI is just a map of everything that ended up on the internet, right? All of it produced by humans at one point. And then it's just accessing these things that just happened to be produced by all of us. And it doesn't very clearly understand the difference between right and wrong. A really good example of how this works is, so on X, during the dismantling of USAID, there was this thing where someone used Grok to come up with 20 red flags about the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a big donating organization that works on a lot of democracy and governance programs around the world. And Grok did.
Grok is the AI tool.
Grok is the AI tool that X has invented. And Grok did that, and then Elon Musk retweeted that. And it was these 20 red flags for someone who works on Russian disinformation were immediately identifiable as Chinese and Russian disinformation, like blurbs, basically, about the NED and the work of USAID overseas. Grok doesn't know any better. It's just taking human-produced things and giving it back to you in the form that you asked for. You asked it for red flags. It found them, right? Its sources are Russian propaganda and Chinese propaganda, but it doesn't know that, and it doesn't care because it isn't thinking. It's simply producing what a human being has asked it to produce. It isn't really even an it. It's just a series of logic gates controlled by an algorithm, right? And so it's a mathematical equation that has to do more with adjacency than anything else. So then it gets back into human hands, right? So humans made the biased information. A human being told Grok to go and find it. Grok did that, and another human being then pushes that out as fact. And people believe it because the AI gave it to them, right? But the AI didn't produce any of it. And so really what you're looking at is just this, like, people taking advantage of this psychological factor in human beings, this idea that computers are mathematical, and therefore every answer that they give you is going to be math. But language isn't math, right? So this for me is the problem, is that it's now you're going to be in this atmosphere where all of that stuff that's already out there, all that disinformation is being fed back into you without you knowing where it came from, right? And then with this sort of patina of mechanized authority that someone else can then use to use it for a purpose. The purpose of this, the retweet, right, was to basically undermine the ability of the National Endowment for Democracy to continue to do its job so it could be dismantled.
Language isn't math, but there is a math of language, and
sure,
large language models are that. They're a math of language, and I think that's what gives them that credibility, because there is this assumption that because they're trained on everything we've produced, they somehow have access to a deeper truth, or to an average of or that the average of what we produced somehow is the truth, and that in fact is not the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I said a slightly weird thing a moment ago, which I want to unpack a bit, and I said that I felt like the distinction between democracies and non-democracies wasn't that useful. I think what I was trying to get at is that right now there's a lot of feeling on the left in this country that a large part of the country doesn't believe in democracy, and that we've kind of lost sight of that. I keep on going back to the statistic that came out of Pew Research a year or two ago, where they asked Americans if they thought that the US was a good example of democracy, and 72% said no. And to me, that said that this is not simply a phenomenon of the right. There's a lot of people in this country and then elsewhere in the world who just feel like what we call democracy has not been working well for them. I think. So that's why I sort of say that in some ways I find that the insistence on these countries are democratic and those countries are not democratic not very useful, because it elides these real shortcomings in the way that democracy has served people. And you also see this in the way that some people somewhat wistfully look towards a country like China and say, well, they know how to build railways and they know how to build green energy technology, and maybe we should just be more like them.
Right.
I guess where am I going with this question? I keep on having this problem. I start and then I don't know where I'm going.
Well, I mean, the easiest way to build a high-speed train is to have an authoritarian state, because then no one else has a stake in it, and you can just do whatever you want. You just build that train right through someone's living room, and they can say absolutely nothing. So of course they're great at building trains. I mean, and of course we suck at it because all sorts of people don't want high-speed trains going through their backyard or through the middle of a forest full of an endangered species, right? I mean, and that's what kind of sucks about democracy is it's slow and messy and all of those things, but that's also what keeps you from having a high-speed train go right through your living room and not getting compensated for having them tear your house down.
But is it inherent to democracy or to... The reason I ask is there's a thing now called the abundance movement. I don't remember if Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson did their event here or was it somewhere else? It was somewhere else. But there's this book called Abundance by these two journalists. And so there is this rising tide of people on the left or center left saying there is too much government bureaucracy. And in saying so, they're echoing a sentiment that's been on the right for a long time. The government gets in the way of the ability to build. And there is an argument that indeed government, the fetish with procedure, with ticking boxes, with meeting regulations, with trying to encompass all possible perspectives is slowing democratic governance down, and that we need to clear through that in order to have a country or to have a society that works effectively.
Well, okay, so I totally hear that argument, and I know that people think that, and I'll give one really good example, I think, of why this isn't always the case. I believe this fundamentally. The Soviet Union was able to put a satellite into orbit before the United States. This is actually a very complicated story about why we didn't get there first, but that's for another time. We intended not to, for reasons. But so they were very good at that, and that's basically math, right? You use enough energy to chuck an object up into space far enough that it gets caught in Earth's orbit and it goes around in a circle. And the Soviet Union was able to put machines on the moon as well, but it could never put people on the moon. And it had a lot of money to throw at this problem, and it had a lot of engineering to throw at this problem. And my argument about this problem is I really believe it's this. In order to put people on the moon and bring them back alive, you need thousands of people to have agonizing conversations about every single thing that goes into that spaceship, and every single step along the way, open conversations in which they argue and hurt each other's feelings, right? And scream and yell and draw things on boards and do all of this in a place that is safe from retaliation, safe from one person going to their superior and having you thrown into the gulag for not agreeing with them. Because this is actually what happened to Soviet engineers. In fact, some of them designed rockets from the gulag, right? And when in World War II, they figured out that the Germans were indeed crashing through the Red Army and they needed to win this war, they had to pull their best generals out of the gulag to go and fight the Germans, right? We were able to put people on the moon and bring them back, not because of American ingenuity per se, but because of a free environment in which extremely intelligent people were able to go at it against each other and disagree in a space where you could do that. And that's where I think it's like, you hear these words like innovation, all of these things. It's argument. It's being able to say what you feel and have a fight with someone else about it, a respectful fight, a battle with them over ideas, and feel safe in doing that. I mean, the Soviet Union was never able to have a genetic program because they had one geneticist who had a whole bunch of idiotic ideas about genetics, and he got all of the other geneticists literally thrown into the gulag and quite often murdered for having ideas that were correct about genetics. And so they spent 50 years being behind in genetics because of this idiot. And this is the thing. So when we talk about inefficiency is the point of democracy. Inefficiency is how you get things done correctly in the end, and you don't end up having to read the other speech, right? About Neil Armstrong. Have you ever read the other speech that was written, in advance? You don't have to read that speech, because everyone did everything right. Everyone did everything right because everyone fought for every screw on that spaceship and told people they were wrong when they were wrong and won arguments. And that's why that's the atmosphere that gets you ahead. And it comes at a huge cost, of course. But that's what you need to nurture. You need to nurture this space in which I'm safe to disagree with you. And we're not going to go after each other's livelihoods or families or physical well-being, but we're just going to have an argument about values or whatever it is that's in front of us.
Right, which is why intellectual freedom for scientists here is also extremely important.
Extremely important, yes. I mean, because it's the fundamental thing. Yep. That's the thing. I mean, a lot of people say that Neil Armstrong lived, and I believe Neil Armstrong himself said this, because those 3 astronauts died. When that Apollo mission burned on the platform, and everyone realized that they've been rushing things and doing things wrong, they ended up having to go back to the drawing board and have a ton of really hard conversations about what all of them had done that was responsible for killing their friends. Nobody got fired. The same people pushed the space program forward, and they all learned from a really horrible mistake. And I think that's what democracy allows you to do. And I guarantee you, no matter what you think about the Soviet Union, and I know a lot about the Soviet Union and Russia, none of the people who were responsible for killing 3 cosmonauts on a platform would have been able to talk about it openly, solve the problems that made it happen, or do any of the things that would have been necessary for success.
They'd have gone to the Gulag.
They'd have gone to the Gulag, or they would have won whatever interpersonal chess game there was, and then gone on and killed some other cosmonauts, right? And sent the right ones to the Gulag.
Let's talk a bit more about the Soviet Union. There's a quote from the book that I want to read. And it's about there's an encounter in the country that is representing Russia, when a physician there has discovered or is noticing that a great lie has been perpetrated on the people. And so the quote says, when Nikolai protested that the people would understand what had been done, Krotov, who is the head of intelligence, Krotov had told him the state was not interested in whether people believed its lies. The state was not looking for plausible deniability. A good lie could always be punctured with enough work. No, Krotov had said, all they needed was implausible deniability. A lie the population would see through immediately, but would have to pretend they believed, even to themselves. I read that because I feel like there's a lot of implausible deniability going on, in certain countries that we know. And it makes me think, I mean, you spent a lot of time in these post-Soviet countries, and you saw, presumably, at least in some of them, how people lived in that place of having to lie even to themselves, perhaps because it was too painful to admit the truth and keep on living with it. Do you have a sense of how one maintains one's hold on truth when one is being compelled in this way to pretend that the lie is true?
So I'll tell you a story. I when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan, I taught Animal Farm to my students. And Turkmenistan was the North Korea of Central Asia. That's what they called it at the time, because we as Americans love to compare things like the X of Y. It's like our thing. But accurate enough. It was a terrible authoritarian dictatorship in which the president, basically had total control. And I taught Animal Farm at a university in the capital. And the way that I did it was I went to the dean of the school and I said, I would like to teach this book. And the dean said, what is the book? And I said, this book is Animal Farm by George Orwell. And the dean said, what's it about? I said, it's about animals who run a farm. And the dean says, okay. So I taught it. And we get to that part where they start changing the rules around, and it goes from all animals are equal to all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And when you were an American kid, you immediately recognize that this was bullshit, right? That the two things could not possibly be true. If all animals are equal, then some animals cannot be more equal than others. And in fact, there is no such thing as more equal. Well, none of my students in Turkmenistan blinked an eye. They did not understand that anything had been changed or that a statement that was not true had been made, because it was perfectly true in the Soviet Union and afterward that all animals are equal, and some animals are more equal than others, right? They had been taught that these things could be true, that all people under communism had the same rights, but that some people under communism were given things that others were not, right? And that the reasons for that were simply their connections or whatever it was, right? That's not to say that like we don't have a deep capacity for doublethink, right? And that this isn't something that we're extremely good at. I mean, I think that one of my students pointed out in Turkmenistan that he thought it was really interesting that no matter what Americans did in the world, somehow we were always the good guys. And that, like, if there were Americans in the film that weren't the good guys, it was always other Americans who were the real Americans and the real good guys that stopped the bad ones from doing the thing, so that in the end, we were the good guys still. And they were like, that's really good that you can believe that you're always the good guys, because we usually can't. And then you have to like think about, you know, being the bad guy. And I immediately left that conversation thinking that you're the bad guy when you actually are probably is the better thing. But thinking you're the good guy all the time really helps you carry on, right?
Yeah. All right, I think we should open this up to some questions.
Yes, please.
Oh, you need this, sorry.
Yeah, it's old school. Sorry. We're caught. There we go. Got it. Thank you. So I think we're going to start from back here.
Yes. Hello. So loud. I'm just curious, since the conversation delved into AI or your book and talking about democracy, I'm curious about what you think about the use of democratization of things that AI is supposed to bring about. I just have been following the use of that word and how people think about it, and I'm curious if you have thought of that.
I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it could possibly mean. Honestly, if someone could explain to me what democratization has to do with AI, I'd be open to hearing it. But I don't understand what that could possibly mean. Like in a democracy, one of the fundamental things that we do is decide who has the right to vote and who does not, right? And AI does not so far, right? So I just don't know what one thing has to do with the other. And then when I think about like how they might use it, it seems like it would be used to find some kind of common solution for a problem. But my argument would be that there really are no common solutions for things. There are common causes and there are common problems, right? And we don't come to solutions, we come to process that improves the common problem and makes it less painful for as many people as possible, for example, right? But like common solutions, like common solutions scare the heck out of me, because they're things like I say something that's true, you say something that's a lie, we decide that the thing in the middle is good enough. But that's not okay. And there's nothing common about that, because like the middling lie is just as bad as the bad lie, or maybe it's not as bad, but it's not the truth, right? So AI has this problem, right, where it's like if you ask it something, it gives you the most common answer, and then the assumption that would be the most democratic answer, right, or the most correct answer is super problematic, and I think it would lead away from democratization, really.
actually have strong views on the word democratization. I think it's one of the biggest scams that the tech industry has been able to pull over on us, because they use the word to mean putting tools in the hands of lots of people and thereby, in theory, empowering them. But there is another word for putting a tool in the hands of lots of people, and that is called selling, right? When you sell the tool or you give it, you let a lot of people have it, you are selling your product. And somehow the industry has convinced us that this needs to be called democratization, and that is really just a euphemism.
Hi, 3 quick things. Is there any plan for a short story collection?
Yes, I just sold the short story collection to my publisher, packaged with the next book.
Yay, cool. Then 2 other things. How does your non-writing career and your writing career, how do they interact? And then one observation is that all of your 3 books have some LGBTQ stuff in them, and it's noted and really, really appreciated. Thank you.
I'm glad. Thank you. Well, what was the middle one?
How does your government...
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I think if I have like a superpower, right? My superpower is being really curious about everything. There's almost nothing in the world when I encounter it and I'm like, I don't want to know anything else about that. Like, I don't need to know anything else about that. I'm like the absolute king of going down rabbit holes on like everything. Like, I really want to know, like, well, what makes, this true? Like, what makes that happen? What are the motivations behind that? I'm super interested, and that, I think, empowers my writing. And the great thing about my job is, I get to change my job every couple of years, and I'm forced to learn a whole new set of things every few years. I'm about to go into the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, which is this red phone between Moscow and Washington, D.C., and I've had to learn a ton about nuclear armaments and the history of that and the history of spy satellites and like all of these things. And for me, learning is a joy, and so I always see it as this opportunity, right? Like, I never have gone into like a language and be like, I don't want to learn Azerbaijani. Only, 40 million people in the world speak Azerbaijani. Like, this is a waste of time. No, I've always been like, this is fascinating. You're always going to learn something really cool that's new. And I mean, about the third part, I am the son of a lesbian who, after 4 kids, had to come out in the 80s, right, and try to like rework her entire life around being a lesbian, and that's just part of my life. And like, this is my family, my friends, the people that I care about, and I do not try to put things in books. You know what I mean? Like, it's not being done on like purposefully. It emerges like naturally for me, right? When I see like this makes sense here, it makes sense there. I mean, actually, like, for example, in Where the Axe is Buried, I don't think there's a lot of LGBT stuff in there, or maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I put something in there without thinking. I don't know. There was like less of it, and at some point after I'd written the book, I was like, oh, is this something I should be concerned about? And then I was like, no, I think it's like the fact that like I'm not concerned about putting in or taking out that is like the good thing. That like for me, like this is just a part of life, right? Like we are who we are, and in my ideal world, like we all just do whatever we want to do, and we are who we want to be. And we do that in a way that isn't interfering with other people's ability to do what they want to do or be who they want to be. And that seems really like just, I don't know, normal, right? Like that, it seems reasonable, but that's given my background, right? Like given my background, I'm the kid who like, I feel like my mom was slightly disappointed in me when I like wasn't gay. So it's like a different generation, right? Like there's a little bit of like, oh, that's kind of boring, but like, all right, and a little disappointed that, if she found out, like, she's like, yeah, you're a little too straight, but that's okay. Anyway, thank you.
Good evening. I'd love to hear a little bit more, if it's all right, about your writing process. And you spoke earlier about sort of your daily routine, but I'd love for us to maybe explore a little bit, even on a very granular level, even taking something like the quote that you had read earlier, which is about implausible deniability, which is a pretty stunning line. Is that something where, a line like that, coming up with that and having it in the place in the story that you're telling, is that something where you are, it comes to you in a moment and you write it down, you're like, I think I can use this later? Or is it just the process of when you're writing in sort of that morning fog that you're writing and it gets you to a place like that?
I think it's so some things. So I always carry a notebook with me, right? Which I think is okay. If I had like a piece of advice, like here's the writer giving a piece of advice, and Oscar Wilde famously said, right, like the only thing to do with advice is to give it away. It's never of any use to oneself, which I love. Like, it's such a great line. But I think you should carry a notebook of some kind around, and that includes Evernote on your phone, just so that like when you get a cool idea, you can write it down, because you never know when you're going to use it. And the implausible deniability thing was something that I had thought of watching Russian disinformation. Like, I was just like, it's not about like whether people believe it. It's just about like whether they can. It's about this irritating, and it's like, it's in all disinformation. It's like, yeah, but how do the towers collapse into their own footprint? Like, that looks like, you're just like, oh, fuck. Right? Like, I can explain it to you, but I'm not going to. Right? Like, I just have to be like, and like leave the table. And then that person never, they win every argument, right? Because you just walk away. So it's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of, yes, you're in the moment and like something just comes to you in place, which is cool. And I do think that there's a reason why most writers only work late at night or early in the morning. And there's very few. They've done a study on this, which was interesting, and they found that most writers work like between 10 p.m. and like 7 a.m., but not after 7 or before 10, like most, right? And I was like, oh, that makes sense, because when I was young, I wrote really late at night, and then when I got a little older, I wrote really early in the morning, but it feels the same. And I think it's like the brain's a little hazy, things slip through the cracks a little bit more, they get past that like membrane somehow, and they end up on the page and you're not like worried about them. So I think a little bit of the process is setting yourself up to get those things, and a little bit of the process is having this, document. So more about process. I have, when I'm not writing a novel, I have this document I call the sandbox. And the sandbox is like 50 pages of just totally undeveloped ideas. And by totally undeveloped, I mean like one of them is, you can steal this. You're welcome to steal it. There's a fungus that infects people and it makes them really like baseball. Right? Like, maybe someday, like, I will have like a reason to use that in a story. I don't. But it's there in this, and sometimes I just go through there and I look through these crazy ideas, or I have like crazy titles for stories that I might never write, like Radium Gals, Won't You Come Out Tonight? Right? Like, what is that about? Like, I don't know. Right? But so you just keep that stuff, and you never know. Like, sometimes it's like 15 years. Like the story, the book opens with this quote about creosote. And that creosote idea is something that I first had, like I first discovered this thing about creosote back in the 90s. And I never really had a place to put it until this book. So it was one of those things that just stuck with me forever. So it's kind of like you asked me, what is it? And it's like all of those things. It's like the hazy brain. It's the taking notes. It's the having this kind of stuff just available to you. It's like you're just trying to slow pitch to yourself as much as possible. Like, what are all the things I can do to set myself up to be able to write well?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering, how do you come up with titles? Are you thinking of the title as you write the book, or does it come to you like randomly? I was just wondering because I'm always thinking of titles of books, but sometimes I just like, as I'm writing, I have no idea what's going on.
So they come from different places for sure. The Mountain in the Sea is a funny story. So what happened with The Mountain in the Sea is I wrote a poem when I was on Condal, and I was mostly writing poetry. This was long before I even thought there would be a novel called The Mountain in the Sea, or that I would write what I wrote about. And one of the lines in the book, the line was about crab fishermen who come down to the beach when it's dark to fish for crab right at the shoreline and with a flashlight. And I was thinking about this from the perspective of the fishermen, but then from the perspective of the crabs. And one of the lines in the poem was, an island is a mountain in the sea, right? Thinking that for a crab that walks on the, doesn't swim, but walks, they're walking up onto the peak of this mountain. And as they get to the peak, it actually becomes hard to breathe and all those like things that happen to like a mountain climber. And also this idea about perspective. My general rule in poetry is I cut the line that explains what the poem is. And so I cut that line from the poem because it explained what the poem was about. And later I remembered, I had this poem where I had this like line, this kind of stuck with me in my head. I should use it as the title of this book, which is about, a lot of it is about perspective and seeing the world in different ways. That'd be cool. My agent really hated that title, by the way, and he just really like wanted me to change it, but I couldn't think of anything else, and I could have resisted. So that was how that happened. Then I went back to the poem, and I found that I had no trace of that line having ever existed in the poem, and I couldn't find it anywhere because I had completely eliminated it from history, basically. And I'd saved no version in which an island is a mountain in the sea exists, and maybe I had hallucinated this, in fact. And then where the axe is buried, I don't know if I want to tell you where it comes from. It's a bit of a spoiler, but you'll see. And I would just say that it comes from actually hearing this story, which is told in the book, told in real life by someone. When you read the book, you'll understand. Yeah. So they can kind of come from anywhere. Again, I really think like being a writer is about being attentive, but that's the wonderful thing about being a writer and about being so many other things is it's like an excuse to pay attention to like what you're thinking and write your thoughts down and feel important.
Come to you later when in the writing process, or did you have it when you started?
No, I totally had that when I started the book. Yeah.
What was the date when you wrote that afterword that you read to us, the acknowledgement section?
That afterward was written on the day that there was a big hostage exchange.
But what calendar? How long ago was that?
I forget the calendar day. I think that was in 2023.
So,
or
how
four?
would you,
Four.
if you were writing that acknowledgement section
No, it's not
now,
him.
what would that look like?
Oh. Novels are like this ice core for me of like what you're interested in at the time. And the great thing about them is when you're finished with them, like you're finished, you cut the core off and you go and put it and that's like it. And this, if I was going to write this book today, clearly it would be a very different book because things. And yeah, if I was going to write the acknowledgements, they probably would have been a lot shorter and I would have just focused on my family. I can read you like the end of the acknowledgements. That would not have changed. I'll do that. So, this is the end, and this would not have changed. Lilia, our daughter, was born a month before I began The Mountain in the Sea. She was 4 while Where the Axe Was Buried was being written. She has completely changed my outlook on life. My concern for her future is the main driving force behind this book's creation and behind all of my writing. I want her to live in a better world than the present one, a world where authoritarian government is the rarest aberration and the future is something her generation thinks of with excitement and optimism, not dread. I wouldn't have changed a word of that. That's what I want. and it's not about. I mean, I personally had my life completely changed by becoming a parent. That's not something that's necessary for everyone to go through. I think to have the thoughts that I have after having her. But I really feel like it's like having your heart walk around outside your body, and bringing someone into this world and then thinking they're going to have to live in this world is such a huge, feels like such a weight, right? Yeah.
Gideon, do you have any closing thoughts?
I'm sure I must have written some down. What's your next novel going to be about?
Oh, I'm not going to tell. I will just tell you. I'll tell you a few things. I am going to return to animals more. This book was not about animals. It was more about politics. I'm going to return more to animals again. It is not set in the future. That's two things. So those two things. I think that's probably enough. And I am deep into draft 2, which is more like draft 50 for those of you who know how I write. So I am shaping it, now. And then there's going to be the short story collection. So I'm really excited about that. And the only way I was able to convince anyone to publish a short story collection in the United States was to be like, the French did it. The French published my stories, and I won an award. It was pathetic. I won an award, and it was like the French Hugo. It was amazing. I could win an award if you just published my stories. Publish my stories. Because they're like, oh, short stories. Who cares? This is really, that's the market right now.
I'm going to ask one last question then. Where the Axe is Buried is, I hope you would agree, is a fairly dystopian book. There's been a bit of a movement in science fiction in the last 15 years or so to try to promote more, I wouldn't necessarily say utopian thinking, but more hopeful writing after a long period of dystopia. Do you feel there's value in that, in hopeful visions in speculative fiction?
Yeah, totally. I think, actually, I don't think it's a dystopia. I think there are many dystopian elements in the book, but I don't think it's a dystopian book. So if you're thinking you're going to go into this book and you're just going to come out extremely depressed, my hope in writing it is that, like The Mountain in the Sea and Tusks of Extinction, it is dark, but it is not overwhelmingly, hopefully, dark. I hope it leaves people with a sense that there's something beyond the darkness, because I am a fundamentally optimistic person in the long term. I think we can do this. I think that human beings can succeed at these things that are pretty basic and get away from a lot of the bad stuff that we do. I think we're early in a process that's going to last 40,000 years. And I think that people are going to look back at us like a bunch of barbarians who couldn't figure out stuff that they figured out later on. It's just going to take a really long time. But I think we're going to do it. And those of us in this room and elsewhere who are thinking about how to do it are going to be the ones that people remember. Maybe not individually, but as there were good people back then, who were thinking about how to do things better. And now that we're in this good place, we have them in some ways to thank for building the foundations of that. That's my sort of optimism, right? Am I going to see a better world? It would be nice. What's super depressing to me is I heard someone yesterday was like, my father passed away. And I was like, oh shit, what a terrible time to die. I mean, not that there's a good time to die, but I was just you would feel fuck, right? I just, you want to be I don't know, in the optimistic up curving phase when you go out, everything's gonna be great, not oh God. So I'd like to at least be on the up curve, but yeah, I don't know. I don't want to leave people with the idea that it's a completely dystopian book. I think it's not. I think that solar punk and these kinds of things are really valuable. And I have another thing, and maybe this is the note that I would leave on, is people should read whatever they want. If you like romantasy, that is awesome. And seriously, no judgment. And if you don't like what I write, that's cool. And like whatever you like, if you like 1,000-page fantasy books, you know, and 5 of them in a row, that's great. I think what's wonderful is that we have this community of readers who are thinking and reading, whether it's for escapism, whether, you know, when we like, I read some escapist stuff too, you know, I just don't have enough time to read as much of it as I'd like, but people should read whatever they want. People should just read.
Thank you very much, Ray.